What's up, dudes and dudettes? This is of course Sugi JRPG here, and today we're gonna be continuing our journey through the PS1 classic games, and I feel like we have almost played and reviewed all the important ones so far, excluding things like Chrono Cross and Breath of Fire 4, which are likely gonna be the next titles on the review block. But today we are gonna be talking about Squaresoft's bit lesser known title known as Vagrant Story. And first I want to talk about a bit of the emulation and then talk about the game itself. Now, when it comes to emulating this game on the PS1 version, you basically have two different options for this very crisp HD experience. One being DuckStation and other being RetroArch. The footage that you are seeing in this video is mostly using my DuckStation config here, which allows a very crisp look into these old PS1 textures, I have to say. And this is like one of the most prime examples where you can have a very nice look into your PS1 games. Obviously this doesn't apply to every other PS1 game, and you always have to change these configs a bit based on what type of game you're playing, 2D or 3D. If you want to go with RetroArch, I'm going to be leaving a video made by another YouTube which goes through the whole full config of actually setting it up. It has a lot more things to and adjustments that you can do with RetroArch, but I mean, both in my opinion look very good. There's a bit of differences with the config on RetroArch versus DuckStation that I have here right now, but I ultimately wanted to go with DuckStation because the save file issues I always have with RetroArch are really annoying, making it basically unplayable, so that's why I basically always play with DuckStation. The other benefit of using DuckStation is the cheat codes. So if you're just here to experience the story of the game and not really that interested in actual gameplay, the cheats come out very handy, because there's a lot of things like learning all the abilities in the game, acquiring all the equipment and key items, which basically allows you to go through the certain doors a lot more faster, and also the ability to max out any attribute in the game, which allows you to have massive amounts of health or massive amounts of damage, and this obviously makes the game a lot more smoother or faster overall. Without going into too much in the spoilers, here's a bit of a premise of the game and what exactly is it about. So Vagrant Story takes place in a fictional kingdom of Valendia, which is heavily inspired by medieval France. And the kingdom is amidst of a civil war, and our protagonist, known as Ashley Riot, who is a member of Valendia Knights of the Peace, VKP, which is like a form of a police of sorts in the medieval times, is basically sent to pursue this cult leader known as Sydney, who is head of the Müllenkamp that have laid siege to Duke Barboda's manor to kidnap the Duke's son, Joshua. And from here, the premise expands further into different factions and mysterious people who have their own agendas, and you get to kind of explore this magical, mysterious city known as Leá Monde, and that's basically the whole premise of this game as it starts out. So let's start out with the gameplay, and in a lot of ways the Vagrant Story's combat system is a progenitor what we had in Final Fantasy XII, and I think the reason for that is due to the fact that the director Yasumi Matsuno ended up actually working on 12 later on. And in case you like 12's combat, the chances are there are going to be things you're going to be enjoying also in Vagrant Story. So instead of having this turn-based combat, we have the ability to move around on the field freely while having the option to basically pause and choose who to attack in our range. The range is defined based on the weapon that you currently have equipped, and you can change the weapons mid-battle, which is really cool. And you have things like swords, you have two-handed weapons like spears, you also have crossbows, which have higher range, and also you have magics, obviously. Now, the other part about this targeting system is that there are different types of body parts that certain monsters and Ashley also have. You have right arm, you have left arm, you have the head, you have the body, and then you have the legs. If Ashley's some of the body parts go to red, this will have negative debuff on you. So for example, if your legs go red, your movement speed is cut in half. If your head goes to red, you're not able to cast magic. If your right arm goes to red, your physical damage is cut in half. So you have to basically pay attention to your status of your equipment, repair them, and obviously heal and all that type of stuff. And the idea, you know, the core concept here is actually not that bad, but I think the execution execution wasn't done in the best way possible because, you know, enemies concerned. I wish there would have been always like a one certain weak spot for each enemy type you should always attack. So there's a lot of nuance into this sort of a system, and I think in a paper it kind of seemed okay, but I just think that the execution really wasn't there. When you also attack, you have the ability to do chain attacks by smashing the buttons at the right time. And you can assign different things into these chain attacks, and these are anywhere from poisoned or silencing attacks or things that just add more extra damage to them. This mechanism also has a flip side, which gives you defensive abilities when you are being attacked by the enemy's spells and attacks. It is kind of true that the game isn't exactly for casuals. It doesn't really have any of these inbuilt tutorials, for example, which tell you like, oh, how does this system work and what should I do next and all that type of stuff. I mean, the combat system itself is kind of standard and self-explanatory, but the attributes are probably where the things kind of get confusing. So you have this risk bar next to your health, which basically increases as you attack in the game, and different weapons have different, like, you know, risk gain. So certain weapons might increase your risk at a higher phase than others, and the higher the risk you have, the lower your evasion and your accuracy is for magics and attacks. And obviously then you might have to like just, you know, run around on the map to basically get your risk lower or basically use your items. Now that item kind of, or this mechanism basically prevents you from basically infinitely chaining your attacks and killing the enemies, which is like a good balance system. But in a lot of ways, like, was this really necessary for the game? You could have just like removed the chain limit from the game itself. Like, I just don't fundamentally like this risk mechanic, and it hasn't really aged that well. I think there, you know, in like Souls games we have the fatigue, and that could have been like a much better solution, obviously, which I'm not necessarily like super big fan of either. The other complex aspect about the game is the equipment and the attributes. There are different types of enemies in the game, like dragons, humans, undead, and different weapons do different damage at certain enemies. There's like different, like your sharp weapons, blunt weapons, and etc. And you have to kind of keep, you know, track of all of these different weapon types all the time. Obviously, you're able to carry different weapons inside the game, but there's a limit on your inventory and limit in your chests, and the chests were like, you know, tied into your saving systems, which was really weird, like a mechanic to basically add it on. And it's kind of like slow and tedious to change all the weapons all the time and like upgrade them and, you know, combine items and also dismantle them. Like it was like just not very nice to manage, especially when there was so much limitations on how much you could carry and how much items could be stored in your chest, which fundamentally I just, you know, it just kind of like speaks a lot of volume of these earlier PS1 and PS2 games where there were so many limitations on functionalities like these. And just like, I just kind of like these JRPG games where there's just no inventory limits. It just doesn't really, like, it's not good game design in a lot of ways. And then obviously the crafting system, as I already alluded, you have certain functionalities that you can do on anywhere, but some of the functionalities are only available in these workshops, which are kind of scattered around the world, and they don't pop out that frequently really. But later on in the game, you will get a teleport ability, which allows you to basically teleport into these workshops much more easier and frequently. Now, your way of getting better in the game is ultimately tied into the better items that you get in the game, because there is no leveling system inside the game. Another game design choice that I don't necessarily agree with, especially because the item system is so complex and you don't exactly get dropped these massive, you know, great items. Most you have to basically craft out, and the crafting guides and tools are not exactly the most convenient, even with walkthroughs. And when you clear out the boss battle, you will get this RNG trade bonus. Like, you can choose to have, it's like a slot reel, and you can get MP, you can get health, you can get strength, you can get agility or intelligence. And obviously with the emulator, you have this quick save function and quick load function, which basically allows you to basically get the best you know, attribute that you basically want to. Obviously these statistics are also going to be crossing over to New Game Plus, which also has a new extra dungeon. Now, the game is kind of broken down into these different zones, in caves, cellars, and castles, basically. you know, and then there's also a map that you can see on the menu to kind of track where you are. I have to say it wasn't always super helpful because the game is kind of like Metro style design. There you are going backtracking sometimes and going through this door and that door, and it's sometimes really hard to keep track where you are and where you need to go because the game doesn't exactly like tell you where you need to go. You just kind of need to go into some new area, and how do I get into the new area? Well, who knows? That's why I kind of played with walkthrough here. But the teleport spot obviously kind of also help you with that later on to kind of get into these points a lot more faster. But other design choice about these dungeons I really didn't like is that they were kind of monotone and they were kind of similar looking, and that didn't really help about remembering where I was just a minute ago or etc. And also some of these teleport locations and save spots, and which are these blue circles, were all hosted with monsters and enemies, and I don't think that's a good design. You just fundamentally need these safe houses and workshops to wear those, but I fundamentally think that all the teleport locations and safe spots always should be like free of enemies. Like if I'm going to, you know, travel into safety, I don't want to travel into a location which has enemies that are going to be instantly attacking me once I teleport there. So that was something I didn't really like in terms of game design choice. Obviously because it was fully 3D game, you had these limitations where the zones were really small and obviously the load times weren't necessarily not that great. On emulator they're good, but I'm just saying that, you know, going through these different locations, like it would be really hard to remake the game because, and this is kind of what 12 also had issues that where there's all the locations were kind of narrowed down into these very small, you know, corridors and stuff like that, and if the game would be remade, like these would have to be removed or made larger again or merge a couple of the zones together with each other. The last aspect about the game is the puzzles, and these get gradually harder as you progress through the game. I think at the beginning they were kind of fun and they kind of like, you know, were good like thinking exercises, but as you get into like some of the very last 2-3 puzzles, those were not really into my liking. And, you know, I mean, they can always be reset and etc., but like I just don't like, they were a pain in the ass, to be honest. And like I kind of like puzzles which have multiple different solutions which allow you to complete the puzzles in different ways. I think that's the best design on puzzles that you can generally do, like chess or etc. Like chess is a game, but it's like a puzzle. There's many ways to win. That's what I kind of like. But yeah, I didn't like some of the later game puzzles, and some people might be struggling with them if you kind of have low IQ. But you know, there's obviously guides out there in YouTube which tell you basically how to basically get through these. But yes, and then there's obviously the platforming aspect, which to me, even with this higher FPS that I played through, was actually like quite comfortable, and I didn't have any bad experiences with that. When it comes to the music and the audio, I do have to say that the JRPG games of this era set the standard really high, so I can't really put Vagrant Story as same pedestal as them. However, I do want to give credit for creating these great ambient tracks which really created this dark fantasy atmosphere in the game for the levels. And I remember playing this game as a kid, and when it was kind of spooky, you had these zombies and then this sort of a dark eerie music on the background, like it kind of brought a bit of atmosphere. It was kind of spooky game to play, to be honest. But outside from those like ambient tracks, there are some solid tracks. For example, the intro theme, which by the way has this girl like dancing on fire, which doesn't even appear on the game, which is probably part of the cut content, which we're going to be talking about a bit later. But like the intro theme was great, and there were some tracks that played during the cutscenes that I enjoyed. But I really wouldn't go out and, you know, listen to soundtrack outside of this game, really, outside from maybe the intro theme or something. So it's a really kind of middle of the pack type of a soundtrack for me. And obviously they were not really trying to go out for this Final Fantasy style soundtrack with like battle themes. There isn't any like battle tracks whatsoever inside this game. The ambient track keeps playing even when you enter to the combat, by the way, but there is some tracks obviously on the boss battles. As for the audio design, I don't really have much to add there. I think it's pretty standard, run-of-the-mill things for this era. And lastly, of course, we are going to be talking about the story, and there will be some minor spoilers here, so in case you don't want to know absolutely anything about the game's story, then you can skip to the last segment of this video. Now, if I would have to describe the story, it is kind of like a melting pot of Metal Gear Solid meets Final Fantasy with a glimpse of Resident Evil. The cutscenes in this game are very cinematic. The cinematography is absolutely fantastic, and it feels very high-end for this generations of consoles, truly, and they have ended up really, really well, especially when you're playing this game with all of these HD functionalities that the emulator basically brings. And this could have been a game from like PS3 era, and the cutscenes are really, really the best parts about this game altogether, and it's really impressive what they were able to do here, given to the fact and the restrictions of the PS1 console, because they got into a lot of these polygon problems throughout the development, because the game was fundamentally done on 3D, and they had to remove a lot of characters from all of these like scenes and etc., because the game couldn't really handle it without the FPS dropping to 5 or something. So it's really spectacular how they, managed to do all of these stuff in this game, and it would have been so interesting to see if this game actually would have been made in PS2, and it could have been actually very, very high-end title if they actually had done the decision, like postpone it and release it on PS2, because that would have removed so many of the problems that the game actually faced. Now, despite the fact that the devs basically had to cut 50% of the original story of the game, according to some sources, it still feels quite wholesome experience. It doesn't feel like, oh, this part feels like very cut out, and this doesn't really like make a lot of sense. There were like maybe a couple of characters that get introduced in the game and they don't get fleshed out properly because of this set cut content, and obviously there was like plans to also have other playable characters which would accompany you, but these were obviously cut to the polygon restrictions. So the game, even though so much of it's cut, it still brings out a quite wholesome experience, and this could be turned into a whole movie basically, and it wouldn't feel like unnatural or anything basically. So I have to say that I think they did a great job here of, like, despite the limitations in terms of the story, there's a great deal of intriguing characters, solid twists, and it makes the player think twice. What exactly is going on in Valentia right now, and who are the bad guys, who are the good guys, etc. Even though there isn't like voice acting in the game, I have to really say that I was really impressed by the performances in the game of the characters like Sydney, Melrose, Ashley the main character, and Hardin. There isn't like a massive amounts of character development for some of these characters outside from Ashley, who obviously is the main character and you experience all of these segments and scenes through his eyes and to his own personal experiences. So he's kind of like the only character that goes through a certain amount of revelations and kind of like learns about his own past, like what exactly happened here and what happened in my past. So he will go through some type of ordeal, but he doesn't exactly like change as a character, or his personality doesn't change throughout the game, but he will go through like a lot of revelations, as I said. And there's obviously a bit of an open-ended ending here, which kind of leaves into a possible sequel in case they ever want to do that, and I think they should. And so I kind of like that. So the character development and the characters were actually like engaging despite being such an old game, and there were obviously like animations like smiles and faces, which was impressive to see in this type of a game. And it's very hard to see any games like that in PS1 which like have facial expressions. And I admit that there were a lot of like info dumping at the beginning of this game regarding all these organizations like the VKP, the Riskbreakers, the Cardinal Knights, the Müllenkamp, and this can be a bit confusing. So if you're not really paying attention in the beginning when they just like lay out like all of these events that basically take place, this could have been executed a bit better way. Like they could have shown a bit of the events like a couple of hours before the game starts and kind of like go into a bit more into what's going on in the beginning, and spread it out a bit. And maybe they cut out content. I don't know if they cut out in the beginning exactly. That's not how it feels like. I think they cut out a lot of the stuff in the mid game and perhaps in the end part. And it just like I felt that info dump was probably going to be hard to follow a bit if you're not paying a lot of attention in the beginning. That's how I felt about it, at least. Now, and I feel like a lot of this could have been executed a lot better in the game it was remade today. There could have been like these info logs which kind of explain about these organizations, who are who and who works for who. That was going to be a bit of a hurdle, kind of realize in the beginning. There's also other characters that get introduced in the very beginning and not so much in the middle of the game or the end of the game. That's like everything is introduced in the beginning, and then it's just like a massive info dump. And then for my closing statement, I really truly believe that the best element of Vagrant Story truly is the story and the cinematic execution of it. And the gameplay itself really hasn't aged that well in my opinion, outside from the puzzles and the platforming, which I did enjoy a bit. But fundamentally, a lot of the game's problems were due to the limitations of PS1, and I really think that if they would have to remake this game, they would have to basically do it from the scratch, because a lot of the problems really existed due to the limitations of PS1, and it cannot be just simply fixed with some texture upscales and rehaul of the saving systems. They have to redesign the levels, they have to add the cutout story content, and also they have to add the party system inside the game, which was originally planned. So in a lot of ways, I think if this game just would have been released in PS2, it would have been a bit of a hit in my opinion, and it could have been so much more better gameplay experience altogether, because as I said, those polygon limitations were so much crucial to this game's design development. And I do think that there is a lot of potentials, as I said, for a sequel game or a remake, because Square has actually gone through remaking a lot of their older games and titles. I mean, this was critically acclaimed game when it was released, so I think there is a possibility that they might revisit the story of Valentia once more, whatever that is, through a remake or a sequel game, but I would happily welcome either one. And as always, please subscribe to the channel, please keep supporting me by liking the video, leave comments, what do you think about this game, has it aged well, etc, yada yada yada. I will be seeing you in the next review when it will be coming out, whatever that is, a PS1 classic or some more modern title. Thanks for watching, see you soon.